session included in the Domestic Violence Conference is something that really means a lot to me. October is both Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but it's also LGBTQ History Month. And I feel like this session really explores these intersections. So I'm so grateful we could bring this training to our county. I know we received inquiries and requests around a training with an LGBTQ lens and focus. And I'm also extremely inspired by all of you, the participants that are taking this training, and inspired by your commitment to providing LGBTQ inclusive and responsive support and services. This is a really impactful step towards creating a more affirming Santa Clara County for all of our residents. So we welcome your questions during this session. We have reserved the last 15 minutes to answer them. You could type your questions using the Q&A, the question and answer feature on your screen in the Zoom platform. Please also be on the lookout for a post evaluation that you'll have in your email box. The feedback and input is really critical, and we really would appreciate hearing from you. The PowerPoints that will be part of today's session will also be available on the website of the Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention. So a link will be placed in your chat where you'll be able to access them. So don't worry about quickly trying to take notes or pictures of your screen. You can have access to all those presentations. It's really a pleasure and an honor and privilege to introduce the presenters for today's webinar. Please give a virtual welcome to Kyle Neal and Gloria Delgadillo Martinez from Community United Against Violence, or QUAV for short. Their bios are just simply amazing, and I think it gives a glimpse into their brilliance and just how special it is to have them here for us. So I'm just gonna quickly read them, and then I'm gonna hand it over for today's session. So Kyle is an abolitionist born in Montreal, Quebec, and has been in the San Francisco Bay Area since 2013. Kyle holds a BA in African and African American Studies from Stanford University. For the past 6 years, Kyle's movement work has involved anti-violence work, organizing to close down one of San Francisco's jails, supporting currently and formerly incarcerated Black trans people, and fighting for liberation for Black, queer, and trans communities. As a Survivors Advocating for Freedom Today program manager at QUAV, Kyle focuses on member leadership development, peer advocacy, healing justice, and organizing. Kyle also enjoys reading, being near water, learning tarot, and watching anime. Thanks so much and welcome, Kyle. And I'll have to get a tarot reading from you after this. So Gloria is a Latinx Bay Area native. She graduated with a degree in Gender and Women's Studies from UC Berkeley, where she became passionate about the history of LGBTQI+ communities of color and the intersectionality of identities. She has worked with a few community-based nonprofits, including some dedicated to education equality and disability rights. She currently works as a bilingual peer advocate for QUAV, serving survivors of violence in the LGBTQI+ community. She lives with her wife in the East Bay, where she enjoys visiting beaches, gardening, and trying new foods. So I see a group beach trip to the future once we're all out of the woods with COVID. So thank you so much to Kyle and Gloria. I will hand it over to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think I speak for both myself and Kyle in saying that this has been a great experience just preparing for this presentation and to be a part of it, and also your Domestic Violence Awareness Month trainings. So I am happy to be here. So I'm Gloria. My pronouns are she, hers, ella, and welcome to the space. And I'm gonna just pass it over to Kyle so he could just say hi.
Hi folks, good morning. My name is Kyle, and I use any gender pronouns, and I've been working with QUAV formally for the last 2 years.
And I had just hit my 1-year mark with QUAV actually a few days ago, so I'm super happy about that. Welcome. So this presentation is supporting queer and trans survivors of violence. And I wanted to just ask Carla if she could, oh, actually you're right. So this is the overview of what we'll be talking about. I know it looks pretty jam-packed, but it's gonna go by pretty fast. I know it. So we have co-op history services, key terminology. It's about intimate partner violence and domestic violence in LGBTQI relationships, power and control wheel and tactics of abuse, domestic violence assessment tools, understanding violence, barriers to accessing services, key principles for supporting LGBTQI survivors, and takeaways and questions. And I'm going to ask Carla if she could pull up the first poll question for folks. Since typically we have these presentations in person and we have like smaller groups where everyone typically shares. If you could just answer what best describes your role in the community as a welcome. I'll give you just maybe a few minutes to fill that out. Thank you, Carla. So I see that a number of you are joining us from nonprofits in Santa Clara County, and a few of you are government staffers, and a few of you are from law enforcement and community members. That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining. And I'd be curious to know what the other is, because that's 7%. That looks like a number of you. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to just hearing your questions in the future. Okay.
So hello again. So I just wanted to give a very quick overview about KUAV, our organization, and kind of just ground us in our history before we really start breaking into and talking a little bit more about what it looks like to support queer and trans survivors of violence, in particular of domestic violence, and intimate partner violence. And so just as a little bit of context, KUAV, we were founded in 1979. And so we just hit our 40th anniversary last year. We're the first and the oldest LGBTQ anti-violence organization in the nation. I think it's just also really important for us just to talk about our history in particular, given the fact that we are a San Francisco-based organization, and right in the 70s, there was a lot of violence from the police, in particular against queer and trans folks, really that's how we got founded, was folks beginning to ask themselves, how can we keep each other safe? And folks really began to like organize and come together and really think through community solutions that respond to violence. And that kind of began the inception of our organization, as well as a lot of other LGBTQ anti-violence organizations all around the nation. And so I just wanted to briefly share our mission, and then I'll be talking a little bit more about our services and the work that we specifically do here at KUAV. And so the mission is founded in 1979. KUAV works to build the power of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities to transform violence and oppression. We support the healing and leadership of those impacted by abuse and mobilize our broader communities to replace cycles of trauma with cycles of safety and liberation. And also, as part of a larger social justice movement, KUAV works to create truly safe communities where everyone can thrive. And so just in thinking about this as our mission, right, our communities as queer and trans folks, we experience a lot of violence. I briefly referenced the violence that our communities faced in the 70s in terms of police violence, right? We also at KUAV do work around hate violence, as well as domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And so, right, we notice that it's not just, violence that's coming to us from the state and from individuals that are enacting, preconceived notions against our communities, but also, there also are times when we also create and cause harm within our own communities. And so we at KUAV try and address those three types of violence in particular. And so just in briefly talking about our services and the work that we specifically do, as I had mentioned, are the three types of violence that we primarily support folks around is domestic violence / intimate partner violence, hate violence, and police violence. And the services that we offer are peer advocacy-based counseling, so short-term one-on-one counseling, support groups such as Take Care Tuesday, healing through art and mindfulness, and mindful movement for POC healing, and offer lots of trainings such as this one, supporting queer and trans survivors, Trans 101, understanding violence, and doing arts-based healing for survivors. I also just wanted to briefly share that all of our services are bilingual. And so for the peer counseling support groups, trainings, and leadership development, all of our work is both in English and Spanish for folks, and all of our services are also free. So if you have any folks that you think might be a good fit or might need some additional support, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll definitely figure out how we can support them the best ways that we can. And then also just wanting to talk a little bit more about some of the larger organizing work that we do. We have a leadership development program called Survivors Advocating for Freedom Today. And that basically is just a program for survivors who want to get involved in advocating for liberation for our communities against the violence that we experience, as well as a lot of the root causes of the violence that we experience. And so some of the coalitions that we're involved in, such as the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, the Domestic Violence Consortium, Free SF, the No New SF Jail Coalition, the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, and Our Trans Home, all really work to address different types of expressions as well as roots of violence that are really impacting and harming our communities as a whole. All right. Before we really get into like the thick of it, one of the things that we like to just normally start off with is just briefly going over some of the key terms, just so that we all are a little bit more on the same page. One thing I want to make really clear is that some of these key terms, right, we have, it seems like 10 or 11 key terms on here. Right, when we engage with the LGBTQ community, the queer and trans community, there are so many more words and terms and language that we can be using. And so by no way is this list of terms exhaustive. But I just wanted to highlight a few of them just so that we're on the same page about some of the language and terms for how to engage with queer and trans folks, and just understanding how gender and sexuality kind of moves within our community. And so the first three terms kind of can be considered and thought about as like the big kind of umbrella terms of how we think about gender and sexuality. And so the first term is sexual orientation. And so this one is, you know, connected to the gender that someone is attracted to romantically and sexually. And then moving into gender identity, right, that is someone's internal sense of what their gender is. And so that's how they would personally identify with their gender in particular. Moving into gender expression is how someone chooses to represent their relationship to gender. So this can be, you know, their appearance, their dress, their behavior, and you know, sometimes it might not necessarily align with someone's internal gender identity. And so, right, especially when it comes to safety, or how someone might choose to present, that all really kind of depends on how folks are feeling in the moment, whether they're feeling safe at the moment, as well as a list of a lot of other factors. And so I think just the important thing to remember is that gender identity and gender expression are not the same. And that gender identity is the internal sense of gender, is how like I personally would identify my gender, whereas gender expression is kind of how you choose to present it to the world and to others. And so a few other terms that I also wanted to just briefly talk about is the term queer. I use the term like LGBTQI and queer and trans very interchangeably throughout this presentation. And so I just wanted to give a really quick history of the word queer. So for folks who might not know, the term queer um, in the past historically has been used as a slur to gay and lesbian folks. And with the newer and younger generations, folks have been able to like reclaim it. And so there are a lot of different definitions for the word queer. And some people choose to identify with the term queer. Some folks choose not to. And I think just one of the ways in which people talk about queer can be a political identity. It can be connected to, sexuality, and it also can be used as an umbrella term for the larger LGBTQ community. And so I think, right, the important thing is, and with all of these terms in particular, when you're engaging with folks, just asking, like, right, how do you identify? How would you like me to refer to you as? Rather than kind of prescribing terms for folks, because some terms might apply to certain people, whereas others they might not. And then the next term that I wanted to just talk about in the next kind of clump is transgender, transsexual, two-spirit, and intersex, and gender nonconforming. And so I think folks might have heard the term transgender before, and that really just describes anyone who their gender identity is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And so, right, just thinking about, you pop out, the doctor, you know, looks at your genitalia and then tells you, like, right, here is the gender of your child. And transgender is basically when that doesn't align with what, the your sex is assigned at birth. And that frequently the term transgender or the terms trans can be an umbrella term for anyone within the like trans spectrum. And thinking about the term transsexual, this is also a term that is a little bit older, and this term came before the term transgender. And so this term specifically just refers to someone who is wanting to or has chosen to change their sex. And so, right, this could be someone who identifies as male to female, female to male, post-op, pre-op, non-op. So thinking about, if someone is choosing and would like to, get some sort of medical transition as well. And so, right, when we think about the term transsexual, some folks might choose to identify with it. Some folks might choose not to identify with it. I really love the term two-spirit, and this really talks about a third gender for some of the like Indigenous, Native American, and First Nations tribes, and it really is in some nations and in some communities for Indigenous folks is a way to talk about a person having a third gender that is not male or female, and for different Indigenous communities it means different things. And so some Indigenous communities have terms like two-spirit, others don't. And I think, what is really helpful about this term in particular is just a reminder that, right, when we are talking about these terms like gender and sexuality and trans and transsexual, that it also is very culture specific. And so if you go to a different community in a different culture, right, folks are thinking about gender and sexuality differently. And so it's really important for us also just to be really conscious about not applying blanket terms to talk about, a community and a culture when we don't necessarily know how that community chooses to describe themselves in particular. Um, and then briefly just talking about intersex. So this is a term that is used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit within the typical definition of male or female. And so one thing I think that's just really important to highlight is that, right, frequently when it comes to folks that are intersex, there are a lot of people that are born intersex and then are very frequently forced to um, conform to a specific gender and especially if within medical institutions, right, the doctor will make that assumption and sometimes will, have cause surgery with or without the parent's consent, and frequently without the youth's consent or the baby's consent. Um, Around possibly taking off certain types of anatomy, and then a lot of intersex folks end up not necessarily finding out that they are intersex until a lot later in life. And so I think that's just important for folks to know that this is also very much a practice that still happens in the US in a lot of places. And then the term gender nonconforming, gender queer, and gender non-binary, all of these are different terms, but more generally, this kind of just describes that a person does not necessarily conform to some of the cultural or social expectations around gender. And so, right, this can be that someone is like, I don't identify as a male or female. This could be someone saying, I identify as both a male and female. Someone saying that I identify partially with like being a male and a little bit of being a female. It can be all kinds of different combinations, or completely on a different spectrum. And so I think just the key to these key terms is really that everyone has different definitions for how they want to think about their gender and their sexuality. Right, there are so many more terms that are not on here as well, like asexual, demisexual, and a lot of other types of genders and sexualities. And so I think just gonna continue to um, hone in on the reminder that at the end of the day, like you can't really tell what anyone's gender or sexuality is just by looking at them, and the way that you can provide support, especially as someone who is trying to be an advocate, is just asking folks, right, what are the pronouns that you use, and also just offering up what your pronouns are as well.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm not sure if you were going to answer questions at the end. There was a question that came in while you were talking about different terms, which was the difference between bisexual and pansexual. It's up to you if you want to address it now or later.
Yeah, I can definitely go back. Sorry, I was trying to click on the Q&A thing and it's not working. So thank you for letting me know. Let me just go back for a second. And so the terms bisexual and pansexual. I'm just going to read the different definitions, but the term bisexual means that someone is attracted to people of two or more genders. And so this can be parallel or an alternative to homosexuality and heterosexuality, while others can have it as a blend um, of two. And then the term pansexual can mean being attracted to all or many genders. And I would say that the difference really between the two is right, how a person chooses how if what works best for the person. I think there can be sometimes a common myth that for folks that identify as like bisexual, you can only be attracted to two genders, and people will think that like pansexual, you're just attracted to any gender at all. And really, at the end of the day, bisexual, and especially when we expand our ideas and definition of gender in particular, and that there are more than just male and female, the term bisexual can just mean that it's two or more genders. You're attracted to more than just one gender generally. And so I would say that really the difference is just how a person might choose, like which term that someone might choose feels most comfortable for them at the time.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. I wanted to ask Carla if she could put the next poll question up. Thank you. So what are some of the myths that you've heard about domestic violence and LGBTQI plus relationships? And we've listed a number here. We'll give you a few minutes just to fill out and check all that apply. Great, thank you for answering that question. I see a number of you have heard of the person abusing will always be butch, bigger, stronger. The survivor will always be femme or smaller. And it isn't really violence when the same-sex couple fights. It's just a lover's quarrel between equals is also one that you've heard a lot. And domestic violence is not common in queer and trans communities. And the last one is it is easier for queer and trans survivors of domestic violence to leave than it is for heterosexual counterparts who are married. And I can't read the next one, but it's okay. So I just wanted to address some of these myths. A big one that folks checked in the question was domestic violence is not common in queer and trans communities. So the truth is that I'm not sure if it's the same as in heterosexual relationships, but I feel like the rate of 25 to 32%, basically the same percentage. Given that 1 in 3 queer and trans people have experienced TB, we can assume that there is at least someone in their lives that have been affected by DV. And I feel like that assumption makes it dangerous to just have folks that have experienced violence to come out to folks that may have also experienced violence and have their relationships be judged that way, as in they think it's uncommon or it's something that they don't really believe. So I feel like that could be a dangerous assumption. And then the second myth is it isn't really violence when the same-sex couple fights, it's just a lover's quarrel. And that could be also difficult just because people, they might identify as the same gender, to say that it's okay for them to like hit each other or to just do, any type of violence towards each other. It's also, in the assumption that just because they're the same gender, identify the same, that it's okay. And typically, they make it seem, people have made it seem as though it's less of a relationship. So that is also something that makes folks in the LGBT community have trouble coming forward when they're feeling abused.
Yeah, and I thank you, Gloria, for sharing that. And I think also just with myth number 1 in particular, I think it's really important to really remind folks that queer and trans folks do experience DV in particular and intimate partner violence, because right when we think about the domestic violence movement, like frequently when people are talking about domestic violence, it's always or really frequently just talking about women. And frequently, right, when folks are primarily talking about domestic violence in the context of women, they're talking about cisgender straight women, and they're talking about the person that's causing harm as just being the cisgender heterosexual man. And really, it's important for us to remember that anyone can cause domestic violence, right? Domestic violence is a pattern of power and control. And so anyone has the ability to cause harm and violence in a relationship.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. And the third assumption, or the third myth that you all also saw in the question, is that the person abusing will also be butch or bigger or stronger. And many times it could be a person that doesn't look butch or doesn't appear to be butch or bigger or stronger. It could be a person that is femme or also feminine presenting. It just depends on what their situation is, you know? So it could be someone that doesn't potentially use physical aggression or anything like that towards their partner. It could be emotional, it could be sexual, it could be mental abuse as well, perpetrated on the person. Um, and the last myth is it is easier for LGBTQI survivors of domestic violence to leave than it is for heterosexual counterparts who are married. If it were really that bad, they would just leave. And this is a difficult myth, just because, you know, like folks aren't married, or if they're, you know, just living together, that they could just leave, right? So maybe they don't have any resources available to them. They can't leave, you know, they live together, they love the person, many different things could make it difficult to leave, just the same as heterosexual couples.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Gloria. And I would say that just like right, the other thing to add is also for like myth number four, right? The assumption is that leaving is going to just end the domestic violence. And I think something that's really important for us to also think about is right, thinking about people's self-determination, and how do we be survivor centered, and really asking the survivor, like, right, what do you want to do, rather than just assuming that the survivor wants to leave the situation, because the survivor might not want to leave the situation and might want to just, you know, work on thinking about safety or some other strategies to take care of themselves, for a variety of reasons. And it's not necessarily our place to judge folks as to how they want to respond to violence that's happening to themselves. All right, so I'm sure you all have probably seen the power and control wheel a million times at this point, especially for right, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And you likely have also just seen that there are a lot of different power and control wheels, depending on the type of community that we're talking about. And so we wanted to just briefly share the LGBTQI DV wheel with folks and just go over a few of these different pieces, just so that we have a little bit more context as to right, what is some of the specific LGBTQ dynamics with DV in particular. And I would say that over the course of the last 2 or so years that I've been doing this training, one of the thing or the sections that are most surprising for folks tends to be the transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, and heterosexism that shows up within domestic violence, queer and trans relationships. And so I really wanted to just talk about those in particular for today. And so I think just starting with transphobia, right, how this shows up in domestic violence for queer and trans folks is, you know, using fear or hatred of someone that challenges, you know, any of the traditional gender expression, and or someone who is transsexual, and trying to convince a partner of danger, that the danger of reaching out to others, controlling expressions of gender identity and connection to community, outgoing gender identity, shaming, questioning, and questioning the validity of someone's gender. And so I think that that's just really important for us, specifically to name in particular, um, right? Because someone might choose to transition in a relationship, and you know the partner might not necessarily be very happy about it, and they're just like, I don't want you to tell anyone. I don't want, you know, you to wear X, Y, and Z outfit, and that is right, domestic violence as well. That is using transphobia against someone, or you know, by saying like, oh, you know, you're not a man, or you're not a real woman. right? These are all ways in which transphobia can show up in domestic violence, in particular for our communities. And I think that this is especially important for us to think about because, as you all might have been seeing in the news, that this year there have been almost 30 Black trans folks that have been murdered. And I think that it's really important to know and to like recognize that a lot of the folks that a lot of the Black trans women in particular that have been murdered, um, that is connected to intimate partner violence. Like they have had some kind of relationship with the person that is causing harm, but it's not frequently talked about um, in the larger like community, and frequently even within the larger queer and trans community. And then similarly with the use of homophobia and biphobia in particular, right? Of a partner possibly, saying like, oh, I don't want you hanging out with X, Y, and Z person because you might be, you know, um, trying to date them. And especially for like, I feel like folks don't really talk about biphobia in particular, but right, trying to control someone's ability to you know be with other people, or just spend time with other people, and making the assumption that hey, this person is of a different gender or a different sexuality, you might try and hook up with them. Right, all of these things are examples of how homophobia and biphobia can show up, and right, whether someone is considered real or not real, when they are gay or bisexual or lesbian. And so the bottom half of this wheel in particular, um, some of the ones that I also just wanted to highlight in particular is HIV related abuse. And right, we had in the 70s and the 80s the rise of AIDS, and the severe lack of funding and resources into supporting the entire community, but especially queer and trans folks who are experiencing higher rates of, contracting HIV and having AIDS. And right, there still is a lot of stigma 20 and 30 years later, and even till today, around having HIV. And so blaming, threatening someone, around revealing someone's status, is an example of domestic violence, blaming someone for contracting HIV, or trying to withhold access to medication or services, or even just the use of calling someone dirty, or using an illness to justify abuse. And so I think that that one in particular was one that I wanted to highlight, and then we'll be kind of moving a little bit beyond just this wheel in a second. And so the other ones that we have are intimidation, sexual abuse, economic abuse, and using children, right, which are ones that you also see in the more general power and control wheel for domestic violence. And so, as we are thinking about, right, how are queer and trans people specifically experiencing domestic violence, there are a couple of other things that we really wanted to highlight that we think are really important to note. And one is when thinking about isolation and threatening to out a person, that can be a very powerful tool of control. And right, for example, for me growing up, like I had a friend who threatened to out me, and that sent me in a very like depressive spiral for like a good 6 months. Slash, it kind of took a long time for me to get out of that. And so, right, things like even just outing someone have a very powerful effect on being able to control someone, and their ability to feel liberated and free to be able to live their life in the ways that they want to, or choose how they want to navigate the world. Um, Another one is using vulnerabilities. And so, right, using that as a means of abusing or coercing their partner to stay with one another. Using children in particular, right? We have the Trump administration, and our queer and trans community has really been fighting for years to be able to adopt. Um, and right, to be able to have legal be able to like be a parent to children, and in a lot of states queer and trans folks are not even allowed to. And so I think that that's just really important to name that, right, because of the state, and a lot of the laws and policies around adoption are very centered around cisgender and heterosexual folks. It makes it very challenging for queer and trans folks to be able to legally adopt or legally parent children. And so being able to use that of having like one parent being like, oh well, I'm the legal guardian, so I get control of this child, and since you are not the legal guardian, or you're not the birth parent, right, you don't get to make any of these decisions, and that is another tactic of abuse. Thinking about using small communities, right? I know that we are in the Bay Area, so right, people normally assume that our communities are really large, and in a lot of ways, like even San Francisco is still a very small community, or even the Bay Area. Like there are quite a few queer and trans folks, but it's still a very small community. And so even just thinking about right places that are even more rural that have less access to resources, less folks that are affirming of your gender and sexuality, right, can make it even more challenging to be able to navigate domestic violence. And that can be used as like a tactic um, by the person that is causing harm. And then I think the last two, I really wanted to just make sure that we touch on this in particular, and right around the use of immigration and around state violence, and that it's really important for us to think about, right? Because we in the power and control wheel, we have the term entitlement that was present of like using someone's identity, or using power over someone, like social power, or economic power over someone. And I think it's important for us really to name that, like, right, threatening to call ICE, threatening to call the police, can be and are forms of domestic violence, especially, right, given the history of the US with queer and trans people, and how queer and trans people are uh, experience a lot of violence from the state, through ICE, through the police, through prisons, through jails. And I think, right, it's also important to really like recognize and understand that, right, when you're leveraging institutional violence in isolation, that you are taking even more control away from the survivor. Um, and I think a couple of other things that I briefly wanted to mention is that, you know, some of you all might have heard of VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act. And right, a lot of times within the domestic violence movement, we are very excited when we talk about VAWA, and the need to like continue to protect VAWA. And one of the things that we also need to like remember is that VAWA also really pushes um, for nonprofit service providers, both folks that do like domestic violence as well as work around sexual violence. It really pushes us to push survivors to interact with law enforcement, um, or file a police report in order to, right, be able to access services, or even to just be believed. And right, one of the things that's important is remembering the history of police and how they affect our communities, but also of mandatory arrest laws in which, especially for domestic violence, right, if an officer gets called to the scene of a domestic violence situation, they're required to arrest one of the people at the very least. And so one of the things that we've also found, especially because a lot of the survivors that we work with are queer and trans folks, is that right, it'll either be like a false arrest, which I don't really like the term false arrest, but basically the survivor is the one that ends up getting arrested. Um, or it'll be dual arrests where, right, both the survivor and the person causing harm are both arrested, because law enforcement have a really hard time in understanding domestic violence, and especially domestic violence that is affecting our survivors that are queer and trans as well, because of these assumptions around, you know, right? The person that is bigger and taller and seemingly looking stronger is the person that has to be causing harm, or just choosing not to necessarily believe a survivor. And I think the last piece that I just wanted to add is that, right, we also have to just really remember that the state also causes domestic violence and sexual violence against our communities in particular. And so would also recommend that you check out Survived and Punished, which is a national organization and has a local Bay Area chapter. And they work with criminalized survivors. And so a lot of the survivors that they work with are survivors of domestic violence, as well as sexual violence. And they end up, being locked behind bars. And so a lot of times, our survivors are also being criminalized by the state. And so it's really important for us to think about um, the tactics that are used by both the person causing harm as well as um, by how the state will respond to domestic violence survivors, especially as Black folks, especially as queer and trans folks, right? When frequently our stories are not necessarily believed and when our bodies are being criminalized, and what it means to um, further kind of push survivors to interact with a state that has historically been violent against our communities. And then I have a question that is asking, can we clarify a bit more about how a perpetrator can use vulnerabilities to abuse their partner? That seems unclear. Um, yeah, Gloria, I'm curious if you have any examples that you can think of.
What comes to mind to me is a partner potentially using a disability to, to kind of ask the other partner to like stay, to take care of them in that way. Um, and, or I'm also thinking about like maybe like paying the rent or something like that. I'm not sure if that also applies, especially in the Bay Area, just because, it's so expensive to pay rent at the moment. Um, yeah, so it could be something like that. A disability, like I mentioned. Yeah, I think those are some examples.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the example, especially around disabilities or around housing in particular and using the Bay because, right, sometimes we'll have folks choosing to live with their partner, not necessarily because they want to, but because that's all that they can afford. And right, what if one of the partners makes more money and the survivor is not necessarily able to just up and leave? Right, that's a barrier, and that can like force a survivor to stay, and especially if the person causing harm is choosing to use that and just be like, right, you need to stay with me because where else are you going to go? You're going to end up on the streets. And right, the streets are not safer for our communities, and frequently the shelter system and housing is not safer for us, even within San Francisco, which is right considered one of the like gay meccas. A lot of the survivors that I've worked with have just been like, oh, I don't want to go to this shelter. I don't want to go to this shelter. I don't want to go to this shelter because either the staff or, the community members or the infrastructure are homophobic or transphobic or anti-Black, all of these different things. And so, right, when you're left with even fewer options, they're able, someone who is causing harm is able to further exploit that for folks.
Also, before moving on to to the next slide, there were a few other questions. Claire had asked, what was the name of that organization? I think the last one that you were talking about.
Mhm. And it looks like Julia, or Julie, sorry, put the name in the chat, but the organization is called Survived and Punished. They're a really amazing organization. I definitely recommend you check this out. They also just recently released a campaign, I think it was last week or early this week, where they are working with folks locked up who are survivors, and they're really trying to push Governor Newsom to pardon folks so that they can get released, especially in the context of COVID, and also for being survivors of violence as well. And so please check them out. They're an amazing organization.
And then the last one was to clarify law enforcement has to answer arrest one party when domestic violence occurs when the police are called.
Yes, so this is part of the mandatory arrest policy that is enacted. And so that is one of the requirements. Yeah, is if it is a domestic violence call, then someone needs to be arrested.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle. Okay, so we are going to talk about movie versus snapshot. So this is basically when you're speaking to someone that is a survivor of violence, you want to get a complete picture of their life in order to support them and meet their needs, including DV support, mental health support, basic needs, legal advocacy, and housing. And in order to do that, you just have to ask those questions that really get into what they're going through. So the goal is to gather as much information as possible and in order to connect them to those resources. And then we can't rely on a gender or a list of behaviors to determine who is a survivor. For example, when folks that are experiencing violence, they sometimes have fights with their partner, right? So that's something that they do as a way to basically, to defend themselves. So if someone is trying to hit them or is yelling at them, they're fighting back, for their life. So they sometimes use violence in order to defend themselves. So that's something that you can't say right away. Like if they say something like, "Oh, I hit them back," that's something that you could see. Oh, okay, so they're experiencing physical violence. But if they say like, "Oh, I hit them," you can't just take that and say like, "Oh, they're the person that's perpetrating the violence." And then also just take their life and not their life, sorry, their experience, and just see the whole picture as opposed to just like, the trailer of a movie. You know how sometimes some trailers just go way into the whole movie and you see the whole movie in like 3 minutes. But just take what they're experiencing and then ask those questions of difficult questions to get to what they need. Talk with your coworkers. I know sometimes I've had difficulty with survivors understanding, like assessing their needs, assessing where they're coming from, and I ask my coworkers, and they can give you some really good advice. Check your assumptions based on what you think. I'm sorry. I think there's one more. Is there one more?
Yeah, and then I think the other piece is right. I think it's important to really think about our assumptions, because I know that even for me, and doing the work that I've been doing for the last few years, right? The minute I walk, or the minute someone new is interacting with me, whether it's like over the phone when I'm listening to their story, or they like walk in as a drop in, right? I'm already making assumptions. It's very natural for us to make assumptions and to like kind of get a sense and find out if we're right or not. But I think it's important for us to notice when we are making assumptions, and being like, right, we don't need to necessarily do all of that in this moment, especially right when we're interacting with survivors of violence. Um, and right, I think that's really similar, especially like, and I want to continue going back to that. Right, a lot of people are assuming that someone that is bigger, that is stronger, that is more butch, is a person that's causing harm. And so, right, if you are interacting with someone and you notice that, right, they might fit those marker descriptions, you already might be making that assumption. And I know that I've sometimes made that assumption, and I've had to be like, right, let me sit back, let me pause, and listen to the entire story, as Gloria had mentioned. And right, the other piece that we also find to be just really important is also just really trusting your intuition. So, like, right, what's happening within your body? What's happening? What are you noticing in terms of their body language and how they're responding to you, as well as noticing how you're feeling. Um, and so, right, so this can be, when we say talking about coworkers and or talking with coworkers and talking with others, we can be talking about like at a nonprofit, but also, right, a lot of survivors don't actually go to nonprofits, or to law enforcement, or social services generally to receive support. And so, this is just really important to also be able to do, as you are doing an assessment within community too, is being able to make sure that you're thinking about the larger picture, being able to talk to others, to get a better sense of what is happening, checking your assumptions, and then also just trusting your body, and what are the things that you're noticing and how they're responding to you, as well as how you feel.
We're going to play a video that was made at KUAV, just with a few survivors of violence talking about what they went through. And then we'll just talk about it after.
And I'm gonna just take a second to switch the share settings.
Thank you, Kyle.
Right.
As LGBTQ people of color experience individual violence, they are also dealing with high rates of unemployment, homelessness, and poverty. Over the past 35 years at KUAV, we've learned that the individual violence queer and trans survivors face is deeply related to institutional and systemic discrimination. Therefore, we need integrated solutions that address the current needs of our communities in this time and place.
KUAV stands for Community United Against Violence. We're a membership-based organization in San Francisco working to prevent and intervene in violence within and against our queer and trans communities. We build self-determination by supporting survivors' wellness, also by shifting cultural norms, and by organizing to change the conditions so that we don't have to be so vulnerable to violence. We have curriculum that helps us develop healthy relationship skills in our lives. We take some of those big skills like boundary setting and self-determination, and we break them down into little bite-sized pieces.
Well, when I first came to KUAV, I was being physically, emotionally, mentally, and economically abused by my husband. My experience here at KUAV helped me to realize that I didn't have to be ashamed of being a survivor of domestic violence, because whoever sets out to hurt anyone is to blame for the action, not the actual person. What I learned about celebrating mistakes is that mistakes are something that are going to happen in your life. Not wasting a lot of time being so hard on yourself, pulling yourself down, but allowing yourself the room to make these mistakes, learn from these mistakes, and to make better choices in the future.
El haber vivido violencia doméstica me ha hecho sentir muy sola. Me ha hecho sentir culpable durante mucho tiempo y me ha hecho pensar y me ha hecho ver que a la gente no le gusta inmiscuirse en este tipo de cosas. El haber venido a mis grupos a Cuba, me he encontrado con gente que ha estado viviendo el mismo tipo de violencia. Me he dado cuenta que la violencia no es culpa nuestra.
Cuba feels like family to me. I feel supported. I feel like I'm not judged when I make decisions, and I don't fear being pushed out or excluded when I make a mistake.
Rompiendo el aislamiento y celebrando nuestros errores son dos de las maneras en las que fortalecemos la autodeterminación personal en nosotros. Y así también abrimos espacio para la sanación profunda. Esta sanación es fundamental para el cambio sistémico. Cuando nosotros podemos trabajar en esa sanación, logramos practicar nuevas maneras de ser, con nosotros mismos y con los demás.
So we use insect metaphors as part of our curriculum. One of those metaphors is the butterfly of self-determination, which helps us see that we have the power to make changes in our lives just by starting with recognizing what we're already doing.
La mariposa me gusta porque me enseñó a tomar decisiones, poco a poquito, pero yo tomo mis propias decisiones. He crecido en ello. Por ejemplo, decido a veces no contestar el teléfono a mi ex.
La mariposa nos recuerda que no hay un solo modelo que pueda responder a todos nosotros. Lo que nos ayuda es saber que hay habilidades que podemos practicar para encaminarnos hacia la autodeterminación. Por ejemplo, el escuchar nuestra intuición, el tomar decisiones y el reflexionar sin poner juicio. Y estas son capacidades que podemos practicar infinitamente. Pero si no nos unimos para cambiar las condiciones en las que vivimos, no podremos disminuir la violencia en la que nos enfrentamos.
What I've learned at CUAV about homelessness, well, the homelessness and the hate violence that I've been through, in my experience, I've seen that they are parts of a larger system of oppression. The main similarities that I see that Black and Latino communities go through are the fact that we are profiled, we are underemployed, and we're thrown in jail at high levels. Being at my first march was a little intimidating. I don't like being around a lot of people, but it's a very important issue, so I feel that I needed to overcome that and show my support. That photo of me from that day, it makes me very happy to know that I was just able to be there, and I would love to give that photo to my mom because she would never even believe I would do something like that.
Well, at CUAV, I think that we have a responsibility to address the broader conditions that our survivors are living in. So, for example, if we help a survivor of domestic violence leave their relationship or start looking for other options, they still have to figure out where's their next meal coming from, where are they going to live, things like that. And given these current conditions of high rates of deportation, poverty, and incarceration, those things are daily struggles. And so for us at CUAV, we feel that to change that requires a lot of people standing up together.
Cuando estamos separados, nadie nos escucha. Es muy importante estar unidos y permanecer unidos porque de esa manera somos más fuertes. Un gran ejemplo que tenemos de que unidos somos más fuertes es haber logrado que se implantara la ley en contra de ESCOM aquí en San Francisco después de 3 años de lucha. Eso lo logramos en base a hablar con funcionarios públicos y a través de medios de comunicación también.
Our communities are strong and resilient. At CUAV, we are changing conversations around LGBT safety, asking the question, not how can I respond, but how can we respond together? We are changing and practicing new ways of being because we are worth it and we were born to be heard.
Desde el momento en que nacimos, supimos que pertenecíamos a esta tierra. Respiramos el aire, aunque nadie nos enseñó cómo. Llenamos nuestros pulmones de él y levantamos nuestros puños cerrados al cielo sobre nosotros, sabiendo que podíamos llegar a más, gritando como que nacimos para ser escuchados.
And we may have been shaken, we may have been bruised, but from the moment we got here, we knew we couldn't be silenced. Not by the powers in the big white buildings or by anyone else. Not when we're the ones who put their hunger on our shoulders and carry on.
Desde el momento en que nos encontramos los unos con los otros, supimos que éramos sólidos. Sólidos como la tierra donde nos paramos. Sólidos como los colores que creamos. Cuando el negro y el mestizo se unen y sabemos que somos inquebrantables. Sepan que no nos pueden fracturar por medio de nuestros cuerpos, nuestros vientres, nuestras huellas digitales.
These are our bodies, not pieces they can own and auction off for profit. So from this moment forward, let's keep on fighting. Let's keep on screaming. Screaming like we were born to be heard. To say, yes, we are human. And yes, we are here to stay.
Thank you, Kyle. So this video is just a little snapshot about our community at CUAV. Just some of what a lot of our survivors have gone through. And I just wanted to just take a few minutes and talk about the values that we hold. So these values of liberation, healing, transformation, mutual safety, community, and leadership. Those are some of our principles and values that we have just based on our complicated history. And when addressing the root causes of violence, as we do at CUAV, we focus on just basically so we define hate violence as an acting out of systemic oppression on individuals, and oppression is power and prejudice. We focus on empowering survivors and their self-determination, like the video talked about. Self-determination is basically when a survivor chooses the route that they want to take, like Kyle had mentioned earlier, and we support them that way. We support their empowerment, and we're not telling them to do anything that they don't want to do. And if they're in a relationship, like Kyle had mentioned earlier, we're not telling them leave the relationship immediately. We're basically listening to what they have to say to us, and then support them in any way that we can. And so the root causes of violence that we see and that we address, they're the systems of violence that have existed, including, so CUAV doesn't work with the police at all. We don't let the police come into our organization. And the reason is that the police has been in the systems of oppression that our community has faced in the past. And we have a complicated relationship with them because of the violence that they perpetrated towards the community.
Yeah, and I was just gonna to add that one reason why we're talking a little bit more about like criminalization and the impact that it has on our community, especially as queer and trans survivors of violence, right, and focusing specifically on domestic violence, is that right back in the 90s, CUAV was part of really pushing for these policies like the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and all these other things that also like impacted survivors and then being able to access services. And in realizing, right, the longer term impacts and effects that it's had on our communities of our survivors, you know, being criminalized, of more Black and Brown people being put behind bars, right, because VAWA is part of the 1994 crime bill that, you know, disproportionately impacted Black and Brown folks and threw more folks into the system. And so I think it's really important for us to like, one, acknowledge our role that we have had, right, in trying to, in thinking that we were trying to do something that was going to create more safety for survivors, but realizing that right at the end of the day, that we also were supporting these institutions that are causing more harm to the folks that we work with and our family members as well, that we like really need to more deeply analyze, right? How does this actually affect survivors of violence? Right? What is it beyond just this one individual case, but like the longer term impacts? And really recognizing that at the end of the day, violence, whether you're a survivor of domestic violence, a survivor of hate violence, or a survivor of police violence, is really rooted in isolating us from our community. And so it's really necessary as we're thinking about supporting survivors of violence, that we also are reminding ourselves that we can heal in community, that we can grow in community, and that we can do individual work on ourselves, but we also can do collective work in responding to violence within our community. That, right, domestic violence is not just a, you know, it just affects one individual, but it actually is something that the community can intervene in, and that there are a lot of models for that. And so some of the models that we really, really appreciate and have been involved with have been grounded in right models of like transformative justice and restorative justice, in thinking about how do we respond to violence that don't further criminalize and don't further punish our communities, but recognize that everyone has the possibility of causing violence in our communities, right? Even survivors, right? You know, I have caused violence and I've caused harm, and everyone has the ability to do that, but we also have the ability to transform and to make change. And I think that that's what's really important. Also, in thinking about, right, how do we support survivors, is recognizing that, you know, some of the survivors have made some decisions that we might not be the most excited about. And I know that, you know, there have been moments when, you know, some survivors have been like, I want to do X, Y, and Z thing. And I'm like, I'm not a big fan of that, but I, you know, am holding back my judgment and just being like, right, what is the thing that works for you? What is going to create the most safety? And also, right, there might be some things that we're not the most proud of in terms of how we've had to survive. But it's also important to recognize that, you know, at the end of the day, when we're experiencing violence, we shouldn't be judging folks for how they respond to violence that is being enacted upon them. And rather, we should be supporting them in creating systems of care and support, and also trying to figure out how do we respond to that violence. Um, and right, one of the important pieces is, especially because as we are experiencing violence, we're isolated, we also need to build our individual and collective leadership in being able to respond as a community to violence, so that we don't necessarily need to rely on law enforcement or, you know, other systems that are really punitive against our communities, but rather we can rely on one another to be able to heal, to be able to intervene, and also to create the change that we need for our societies and our communities. And so, Carla, would you be able to add the next poll? Thank you.
So this question is just, what are some barriers that queer and trans survivors may experience in accessing services? This is typically just geared towards, like, in your community, what you've noticed have been some barriers for queer and trans survivors. I'll just give you a few minutes.
Yeah, and I can just read off the different ones that are available. So the first one is turned away from services due to gender or sexual orientation. Number 2 is there's no LGBTQ specific programs, or just being excluded from programs generally. 3 is being misgendered. 4 is lack of knowledge of services that their needs that can meet their needs, and 5 is all of the above.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, so absolutely all of the above. I feel like the majority answered that. And just other barriers that queer and trans survivors may also experience, just based on personal experience with my participants at QUAV. So some folks get turned, well, I feel like everyone gets a little turned off when someone misuses their gender pronouns or misgenders them, and also being turned away from services because of their gender or sexual orientation. And this is usually something that doesn't happen explicitly, like, you know, that person is acting like they're gay or something like that. It's not explicit. It's usually just like a feeling that someone can get of, you know, being judged a little bit and kind of just turned away that way. And also not feeling safe in a space. That is definitely something that creates just this barrier of accessing some services. Also not knowing where to go. So a lot of different organizations, you know, they're not everywhere in, you know, online, or they can't really just look something up like that. So they don't know where to go. And also not having the relationship or themselves taken seriously. Personally, that's something that has happened to me before, just saying like, oh, you know, your relationship, like, oh, it's a phase or something like that. That could really turn someone away. And feeling judgment. So that goes with just not feeling safe in the space, just having people look at them or kind of judge them or the way that they act. Also, a lot of trans women, especially Black trans women, tend to be turned away from shelters. And the reason is that sometimes they're not built to support or culturally competent to support Black trans women. So that's basically just not making them feel prioritized or safe in their spaces. And also a lack of language justice. So some survivors don't just speak Spanish or English, and those are usually the 2 languages that are most used in different spaces. Some survivors speak different languages, and they don't use anything like a language line or have any interpretation or anything like that. And then also survivors could feel when they're not being believed, you know, like they could be turned off when you're asking them questions and you're asking maybe too many questions, or not the wrong, but like incorrect questions that would make them feel just like, oh, you know, they're not believing me, I'm gonna leave, or, you know, anything like that. And domestic violence isolation. Oh, okay. This is when they're themselves and their partner who is using the violence against them, the survivor goes to a certain place and their partner has already gone to that place and told them that they're the one that is being, you know, is having violence towards them. They're the survivor, but in actuality, it's reversed. Sometimes they do that just to block off and isolate the survivor of violence.
Yeah, so all in all, there are a lot of barriers that prevent survivors, especially queer and trans folks, from being able to access services, whether it's a domestic violence restraining orders, or any other kind of services that would be able to support them in accessibility or sustaining themselves. And I also just wanted to go back. I just saw a question asking about partnering with cops that are anti-violent, and that it can, be very helpful to have DV advocates to go out on calls with police officers on every domestic violence call, and this often results in more appropriate police action in the moment of the call. And I would say that, right, as a person that is an abolitionist and as someone that has also experienced a lot of violence from the police, I don't think that this would be a more appropriate action. I know that one of the things that like we have done at KUAV in the past has been, having doing more of these kinds of trainings, like supporting queer and trans survivors to the police, and like we haven't necessarily seen the numbers shift. And I don't think just adding more social workers into police is going to make our people be less criminalized necessarily. And so I would say that it's really important for us also to just imagine creating systems of safety and support that don't rely on the state. And I know that a lot of people already don't rely on the state, because I know that a lot of queer and trans folks, right, especially with all of these different barriers, like don't actually come to a lot of domestic violence organizations. They don't come to a lot of, social service programs. And same with like Black and brown folks, right? There has been a long history of the state and a lot of like nonprofits too, and service providers that aren't able to be culturally competent in supporting our communities. And I don't think that just trying to like make them a little bit more culturally competent is going to create safety for our communities. I think at the end of the day, right, we need to also just be teaching our community members, right, how do we notice domestic violence? How do we intervene on domestic violence? And how do we create systems of support to show up for one another? And I would recommend, right, we're also in this moment of, right, Black Lives Matter, and having all of these conversations around like defunding the police. And I think that, right, these are very important to know, because historically, the domestic violence movement has really intentionally partnered up with law enforcement, with our community members. And there has been a very big push for us to try and separate the two, and be like, right, how do we create safety for our communities that don't actually rely on these systems? And one thing that I would just recommend possibly checking out, there are a lot of resources on thinking about how to not involve the police. But one of them is called Creative Interventions. It's a like 600-page, basically like toolkit on how folks can intervene on domestic violence, that has a combination of like safety planning and making interventions, and how to create safety for the survivor, as well as how to begin to get the person that's causing harm to begin to shift how they interact with community. And there are a lot more resources that are really coming out nowadays. And so I would also recommend like looking at the website called Transform Harm. There are a lot of resources that are connected to like domestic violence, and how folks are able to create safety that don't rely on these systems of police. And so I think, right, the long answer is no, I don't think that having more domestic violence advocates will create more safety for survivors, because I think what will end up happening will be that domestic violence advocates are going to become part of the state, and are going to become even more likely to alienate survivors because of the like close interaction and collaboration with the police, especially when we have survivors that are like, I need some support, and then they end up, someone ends up getting arrested or there is like violence that like then begins to escalate, and we see that DV advocates are now engaged with police in allowing that to happen, in particular. There is another question that's asking, how are the needs of Black trans women different from those of other trans women? One thing that I would just say is, I at KUAV, I am the one that primarily works with the Black trans folks, Black trans women. And one of the things that I kind of just notice is that, right, a lot of our folks are really struggling with housing, either are either street-based, or are experiencing a lot of discrimination within the SROs, the single room occupancy, or like low income housing. One of the things that I kind of just have noticed as well is that when I am working with survivors in particular, and especially Black trans folks, is that, you know, they'll come in and we'll start a conversation and they'll be like, oh, I just had this like, you know, situation of violence that happened a week ago. And then on my way over here, you know, I had, you know, 8 or 9 people, you know, scream derogatory terms at me just on my walk over here. The bus driver was really rude to me. And so like one of the things that I kind of just noticed in particular with Black trans folks experiencing violence is that like, right, it just happens at a very like intense and increased amount of time. And I would say that, right, like folks' needs are going to be different based off of their culture, their community, and how that shows up. And so, right, in thinking about how the state is anti-Black, how the state also is like perpetuating harm against trans people, right, all of these things are going to be very different depending on, you know, how your gender, sexuality, race, class, citizenship status kind of shows up. And so I'd say that that's kind of how some of the needs are different. And I'd say that one of the things that I've just noticed from some of the survivors that I've worked with is that, right, some of the things is that like, you know, some of the survivors aren't necessarily looking necessarily for like a formal counseling session, but are rather like, I need case management, I need X, Y, and Z thing to be navigated because I'm being blocked from accessing X, Y, and Z services. And so I would say that, right, that's one of the things that can be a little bit different is that some of like a lot more of my time is spent doing case management and trying to interact with housing or trying to get people housing or to like try and find resources and have these conversations with different service providers to be like, right, what is the issue here? How do we make sure that they have access to these services? Because our folks are either being barred from services or they're just getting like discriminated against and having to experience violence within that. And we have to do a lot of like interference with all of that as well.
And on that note, just a lot of DV shelters that I've spoken to before, they also have a lot of barriers to like folks that don't have children. So a lot of the shelters are basically for women and children. If I usually call someone looking for a participant of mine looking for shelter, that's the first question they ask. Are they single? Do they have children? And as soon as I say they're single, oh, you know, like they're booked, you know, no more questions asked. But that's what I've noticed just recently.
And that's something that has been happening for years. Like at KUAB, that's one of the things that we really notice is that our people really struggle to get access to housing. Like, right, part of it is like San Francisco, but part of it is also just that our people are just not being prioritized when it comes to being given access to housing because DV funding prioritizes, right, women and children, and it's primarily cis women and children in particular. All right, so we're nearing the end of our presentation. And so we just wanted to circle back to some of these key principles that we've been kind of talking about throughout this conversation. And so, right, going back to respecting someone's pronoun and name. And so one very easy way to do that is literally just introducing yourself and saying, hi, my name is Kyle. I use these pronouns. Would you mind introducing yourself? Or what name and pronouns do you use? And that's one very easy way of just letting someone know that like you understand what pronouns are, you understand that, you know, people have a variety of genders, and that you respect people's ability to do that. And I think in addition, when you mess up someone's pronouns, just a quick apology and then correcting yourself. So it doesn't need to be like a long-winded apology. It can just be like, you know, Kyle, like saying, for example, I'm just gonna misgender Gloria for a second as an example, but right, Gloria, he said, I'm sorry, she said this, right? That is just a very quick way of being able to respect someone's pronouns, rectifying your mistake, and then just moving on without making a big scene. Something that's really important, number two, is that survivors are the experts of their lives and their safety. And so, right, we need to really support people's self-determination. At the end of the day, we are not the ones that are living through domestic violence, or we're not the ones living through their specific experience of domestic violence. And so what we really need to do is honor people's self-determination and ask them, right, what does safety look like for you? Right, what do you think are some of your next steps? And then, you know, if they're struggling with coming up with some next steps, then being like, right, here are some possible options, but not pushing people to do something that they don't want to do, and also giving them the space to think about it, because survivors deserve that space to be able to make their own decisions. And as DV survivors in particular, right, power and control, like survivors are not given a lot of self-determination, and that's really important to be able to give that back to survivors. Number three is acknowledging the rich diversity within the LGBTQI community, right? So making sure that we don't think about queer and trans people as a monolith, that, you know, the experience of a gay person is going to be the same as someone who is bisexual or trans, right? Everyone deserves to have the support that is really tailored to their needs in particular. Number four, and this was kind of mentioned in there in the video that we shared, but we cannot change anyone's behavior, and we can't change anyone. And so what we really like to focus in on is what are the things that we can change for ourselves, and how can we be responsible and accountable for our own behaviors. Number five, countering isolation through non-shaming. So frequently, right, as survivors of violence, and one of the folks in the video briefly talked about, you know, experiencing some shame from experiencing violence. And it's like, right at the end of the day, there is no shame in experiencing violence. Like, violence shouldn't be happening in our communities, and that is one of the tools of violence, is to isolate and shame people. So it is important for us to be able to not shame ourselves and one another, as we are trying to figure out how to survive and to live with one another, and to move through violence that's happening in our communities. Number six is the abuser and survivor binary does not equal bad and good. This one I think is a really key piece. And so one thing that we really like to honor is that people are complex, and that we want to affirm all parts of survivors' experiences while acknowledging that people who have been violent can change if they decide to change. Right, and so there is no perfect domestic violence survivor. You know, there might be a survivor that will, you know, fight back. There might be a survivor that chooses not to fight back. There might be a survivor that will murder, or, you know, kill their partner in self-defense, right? And at the end of the day, that does not necessarily equal that they are good or bad. It means that, right, they are doing different things to survive violence, and we should be able to honor all of that, and then think about, you know, what does it look like for them to have long-term safety, and self-determination for themselves. And also, right, going back to like, how do we also be responsible for our own behaviors? And so I think that's just really important, and also just to honor that, right, people who are also causing harm have the ability to change. And so we don't really use at QUAV the perpetrator versus survivor, or abuser versus survivor, because it kind of just paints a picture of like, right, an abuser is, that's all that they get to be, but rather someone who has caused harm. Every one of us has the ability to cause harm. And all of us have caused harm in some capacity in our lives, and we have the ability to transform. Number 7, so asking respectful questions, right? If you can Google it, you probably don't need to ask it. And so I think that's the general rule of thumb. And if that's something that the survivor, like it's also, if you notice that a survivor is, not comfortable with asking, with the question that you're asking, really thinking about like, right, where is that question coming from? Is that coming from like your curiosity, or is this something that you actually need to know? And then, being able to make that assessment. Number 8, notice your own personal bias. Number 9, having a critical lens about the intersections of violence, gender, and sexuality, right? And so in thinking about, right, if you're trying to push a survivor to do X, Y, and Z thing, what are going to be the impacts? What are the possible impacts of survivors interacting with police? What are the possible impacts of a survivor getting a restraining order, or of a survivor choosing to stay in the situation that they are in? Right, we have to think about all of these things, and make sure that, a survivor might not necessarily know. Like, one of the things that I, have sometimes done is when a survivor is asking to interact with the police, of just being like, right, what do you think will happen when you interact with the police? What have been your previous experiences with interacting with the police? Right, how do you think, what do you think might go well? What do you think will not go well? Just as like a way to open up conversation, and really explore, like, right, is this the decision that I want to make, and how will this possibly impact a survivor? Number 10, so this one is San Francisco specific, so I'm not 100% sure about Santa Clara, and how Santa Clara's policies respond to trans folks, but in San Francisco, you cannot turn away a trans person for services. And this is something that we have to like remind, all of these different organizations and agencies, even within San Francisco. And so also just pushing you to think about that in particular. And yes, I'd love to also hear, Daniel, if you could briefly just share what the policies around, turning away folks for services for gender and sexuality.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm getting my tech set up. Yeah, I think in terms of definitely at the county that, all of our, that it's, I think we have best practices, and also I know that we're working with some trainings with our facilitators at the LA LGBTQ Center for like Rise Train the Trainer to really incorporate, inclusive, welcoming services and having that capacity built in-house in different fields. And I know that there's been multiple organizations that provide services to survivors and supports that have gone through that training. And it's great to see that they're bringing that back to their organizations. But definitely, as a county, we, especially when it comes to services and our equal access, kind of rules and regulations, is exactly as you stated, Kyle, in terms of that you cannot turn away folks for services because they are transgender. And especially, when we're thinking about the current environment we're in with federal, rules and around HUD, trying to roll back, protection specifically for trans folks that are trying to access shelter and housing services, that the county still, stands strong in our commitment to serve all people of all genders, and having, trans, non-binary, gender diverse folks affirmed and welcome in all of our spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, that is definitely very helpful. And so, right, and then the final piece is around understanding your own power and privilege, and how to become a better ally. I know that we haven't spent a lot of time on that piece in particular, but right, I think it's really important for us, especially as individuals. You know, I can't actually see folks, and we had a very brief sense of how folks are coming into this space as like community members, as government officials, as service providers, as law enforcement, and as other, like, right, all of us have different access to different resources. And I think that that's really important to know, and that in a lot of ways, like DV advocates, um, and like service providers and police and the government, right, we all are gatekeepers. Like, we have access to a lot of resources, right? It might not necessarily be a lot. Like, I know that, right, with QAV, it doesn't frequently feel like there are enough resources to support our people, but we still are gatekeepers. And I think that that's really important to like name in particular, for ourselves, as well as like some of our individual um, right, types of power and privilege, whether it's connected to like race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, all of those pieces as well.
What I wanted to add briefly as well, before we move on, number 5 is counter isolation through non-shaming. Something that has been helpful in our support groups is one of our group agreements, which is celebrate your mistakes. And then that kind of, helps folks to feel less shame about something that they have been feeling shame about, that they want to bring up to the group. So I feel like that's a good way for them to just feel a little less judged, to feel a little more comfortable and like accepting that, something that they didn't want to do, but we all do it. We all make mistakes. We all do something that we wish we hadn't. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and thank you so much. So this really is like the end of our presentation. So thank you all for bearing with us. And Carla just told me that the chat is now open, and so we'd love to hear folks' questions, as well as some of your takeaways from this presentation, and really just open it up for us to have a little bit more of a conversation.
Kyle, this is Julie. While we wait for folks to chime in on the chat, can I read you some of the questions from the Q&A?
Yes, that would be amazing.
Okay, certainly. Here's one. Do we have permission to reference this content and the PowerPoint when conducting LGBTQ trainings of our own and in our own organizations? If so, is there a specific way you would like to be credited?
I think you should go for it, and I think it'd be great if you can just reference our organization. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a lot of thoughts on that in particular, but I think it's great if you can share this content to more folks, as long as you just share that we shared it with you.
Thank you, Kyle. Here's another one. What are your thoughts? Oops, my screen went up. Sorry about that. What are your thoughts about restraining orders? Are those useful as survivors are going through a legal process?
I feel like that's a complicated question. I think for some survivors, it creates safety and peace of mind, and is a way of documenting that, if this person is coming near me, that the police is able to respond. So I think for some survivors, it is helpful. And also, at the end of the day, restraining order doesn't necessarily stop someone from coming near you. It just says that there will be legal repercussions if they choose to and they're caught. And so I think, right, it really kind of just depends on like what the survivor feels most comfortable with. At QAV, we don't necessarily we are all we use a peer advocacy based model, and so we don't have any lawyers at our organization, and so normally we just like refer folks over, but we normally just share what I just shared with folks, and just just let them know that right at the end of the day, it won't necessarily stop the violence from happening immediately, but it is one of the ways that they can possibly create more safety if that is the strategy that they want to use.
I'm going to mute myself right now because my phone is ringing. Would you like to look at the chat, Kyle?
Sure. And so I see, what age groups do we serve? Teens. So we primarily work with folks that are above 18. I would say that a majority of the survivors that we work with are like in their 40s up. Though we definitely have folks that are younger that are coming through as well. I would say that for folks that are younger than 18, one of the things that I would just, that we also just have to do is we have to get some sort of like parental consent. And so we definitely still can work with youth, but it just requires a little bit of extra red tape. And then there are some just different like rules and regulations as to mandatory reporting and other things like that, that we would have to like adjust as well.
This is Carla. Now another question in the Q&A about QUAV. Can you share a little about how you're funded?
Yeah, we are funded through a combination of local grants, or not grants, local government funding, as well as some state government funding from like the Department on the Status of Women for San Francisco, I think the district attorney, as well as California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, and a couple of other state grants or state contracts, as well as we also get some private and public foundations to fund us.
And it seems like there's some serious concern about teens not getting access to your services in the chat, as well as do you have specific advice for trans teens?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it is always concerning when folks are not able to access services. And that's one of the things that right next week, we're going to be going into staff retreat, and we're really going to be trying to think about, right, who is able to access our services? How do we want to shift that? I think just one thing is that, yeah, like when it comes to like working with teams in particular, is just that we're a very small staff. We're only 5 folks, or sorry, 6 folks on staff, and we have a very small program staff, 4 of us. And so just in terms of like our capacity, right, we're not like, we tend to prioritize low and no income Black and Brown folks in accessing services because, right, frequently our community is the one that is most barred from accessing services. And specific advice for teens, I'm curious as to if there's something specific that you have in mind in terms of like navigating domestic violence or being a trans teen. So would love a little bit more clarity on that question.
So maybe Kathy can put a little more into the chat and we'll get a better idea. While we wait for that, we have another Q&A. And it sounds like you are really challenging people around your policy not to work with or report to law enforcement. So this person's thinking specifically, are there absolutely any exceptions to your policy? I'm thinking about mandated reporter scenarios where, for example, a client might disclose child abuse.
Yeah, so I would say that, right, we as domestic violence advocates still have mandatory reporting. So there are moments when we might need to, and normally I would have to like check in with my supervisor, and then we would make an assessment, and then she would have to like make a decision. I would say that not interacting with law enforcement, right, we don't let police into our space. We might, go with a survivor to file a police report, to support them in filing a police report. We're not necessarily like filing the police report on their behalf, but we will be there for like emotional support. So one of the things that I will say is that while we're not necessarily like pushing survivors to interact with law enforcement and with police, like we also are there to support survivors as they are interacting with law enforcement. And so I have gone many times to court with survivors as they are navigating legal proceedings and things like that. And that is one of the things that I'm more than okay with doing, but not necessarily like, reaching out and calling police and being like, hey, I would like to do X, Y, and Z thing. Can I refer you over? I think is something very important because a lot of our survivors are already navigating the legal system or navigating immigration services, and they're already forced to interact with that with the state system in some kind of way, and we are trying to figure out how to support them in a way that minimalizes criminalization.
Well, we got clarity on the question related to advice for teens. What about navigating bullying or violence from other peers? How to protect themselves? Do you have any advice that you would like to relate to teens regarding those two things?
Yeah, and Gloria, I'm curious if you also have any ideas that you would like to share before I jump in.
I think in my experience, just coming out a little after high school and having to, kind of be closeted in high school, I would just say to stick with the folks that are supporting you, whether it be a best friend, a sibling, someone at school, a teacher, and they're usually going to be the ones that help you pull yourself through that situation. And I know that, if they're dealing with violence, then to definitely just try to stay away from the person if they don't want to include a teacher or anything like that. I feel like one of my teachers was actually one of the people that was like helping me through a difficult situation that I had with another teacher who was like always telling me it's just a phase, you're going to grow out of it. So I think it's just best to just be yourself as well. If you feel safe to do that, something that has helped. How about you, Kyle?
Thank you. And I would also just share that, we're also in this moment of COVID. And so one of the things that, folks can do is get online support. There are a lot of, spaces and organizations. One example is Lyric within San Francisco that works with teens, and they, do support groups inside of the school. They have like after school programming. And they also have like youth advocates that are able to support teens who are queer and trans. So I think one of the suggestions is, especially since we are so saturated with technology, is that there are spaces for online support, as well as there are actual like organizations that do this support. And another like organization is Breakout Youth Collective, which is based in New Orleans, who also does some really dope work. And so there are different spaces and organizations all over the nation that have a little bit more of a youth focus in particular. And so I would just say that, connecting with folks, and then, testing the waters. Like, you don't have to share everything with someone. And trying to find folks that you can trust and get connected to in order to figure out a little bit more support. And I think just the other thing, and Daniel, I think you might have something that you want to add, so would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that. I love the organizations that you're mentioning. I think they're fantastic recommendations for folks to reach out to. And if you have any, teens or youth that you're either serving or in your life, and you want to refer them to any local organizations that are also doing work virtually right now. So here in Santa Clara County, we have the LGBTQ youth space. They are operating multiple support groups virtually. And once we're able to do in person, they do a lot of community building, a lot of youth leadership programs. So definitely check them out. And then also serving Santa Clara County as outlet. They also serve San Mateo County as well. So they're kind of on the border, but those are two really great local organizations as well that offer virtual support groups, other opportunities, and also at the county, we have the Q Corner, which provides peer support for all ages. And so that's another great resource that youth could reach out to when it comes to navigating services, looking for different supports, and again, all ages. So thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you so much. I think that that is all really helpful, and I'm excited also to get better connected with some of the Santa Clara and San Mateo County organizations that specifically work with youth. And I would say that kind of just addressing Maureen's comment that teens are able to access birth control, but we can't necessarily access services without consent, and that's a big barrier. And yes, you're correct, that is a very big barrier, and legally, that's something that we are not really able to shift or adjust. And so, right, I think that that would require some like advocacy on like a local and statewide level, and possibly a federal level, in being able to specifically work with youth and teens, because there are a lot more restrictions as to like, right, what we can do and what we can't do, especially with like mandatory reporting when it comes to interacting with teens. And so yes, thank you for noticing that barrier, and that is something that, you know, I wish we could shift, and that is something that, you know, we can do organizing around to be able to make it so that teens and youth are able to access services more easily.
So Daniel and Gloria, I'm sorry, Kyle and Gloria, we have one last question and in a minute, so maybe you can at least start to address this. And I think this actually came up during the presentation. Keeping that in perspective, it says, so perpetrators can go into an agency and lie. So we advocates believe the victim anyway, always, right? And what do? You believe until you see evidence to make you not believe, or how do you balance that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say that one of the things that we very briefly touched on was the DV assessment tips. And we actually have another training that's specific to like domestic violence assessments, where we're able to basically look more deeply into right, what is happening with the survivor, because right, there's a lot of language saying like, right, believe survivors. And one of the things that we have to do as domestic violence advocates is think about the movie and not just the snapshots, or not just that one particular moment, but look at what are the patterns of power and control. How did a person's relationship start? Right? Who has had control since the very beginning? How has that shifted? How have patterns shifted over time? And so those are all things that we also do. So at CUAV, we normally, when we are working with survivors, and I'm realizing that we're over time, so I'll end in a second, but we normally do a quick intake just to do a very quick assessment as to what is happening, and if we are the right fit for services, or if we should just, connect them to outside organizations if we're not the right fit. And then we have a longer assessment that we do, where we spend an hour or more kind of just really digging deep into, right, what are the dynamics, and what exactly is happening in this relationship, to be able to make that assessment, to get a sense of, right, are they someone who is causing harm? Are they experiencing harm? And then that kind of gives us a sense as to how we should move, and if we're the right fit for them, and how we should continue to support them, or if there are other folks that we may be able to connect them to. And so we do have processes to be able to make a more clear assessment as to, right, who is the survivor and how are they experiencing violence and or causing violence.
So thank you so much for that. Thank you for your entire presentation. Gloria and Kyle, I hope you have made huge group of new friends here in Santa Clara County, and we welcome working with you and learning with you and keeping the communication open so that we can do even more for all of our residents. And so to Daniel and to all of our colleagues at the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, on behalf of the Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention, we are so grateful for you actually completing a month-long series for us. This month has been absolutely incredible, and the way that we have ended it with your workshop has been absolutely spectacular. We've all learned a lot, and we have a lot of work to do, and we're looking forward to doing it together. So I want to thank you all so very much. Thank you to everyone who joined us and were able to stay on a little bit longer so that we could wrap this all up. We will have all this information on our website, and it will be, the recording should be up soon, and it will be there for until about the end of the year. So if you missed something or you want to go back and take a look, that opportunity is there too, but know that we are all here to work together. And the work, Kyle and Gloria, that you are doing is so incredibly important. We thank you for making the time for us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for attending.
Rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everybody.